Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this UK Data Service workshop on copyright and publishing. My name is Hina, and I work as a senior research data officer within the research data management section in the UK Data Archive based at University of Essex. My colleagues Hina and Gail are also present in today's session, and Hannah will be running the main session, and Gail would be helping us with the technical side of things. So the introductory part of today's session is very brief overview, and it will mainly focus on a brief introduction to the intellectual property rights and what are the types of rights. And as I said earlier, the main session will be run by my colleague Hannah, who will talk you through to the copyright issues in the context of publishing and teaching. So intellectual property is something that you create using your mind. For example, a story, an invention, an artistic work, or a symbol. And the type of IP rights include trademarks, patents, registered designs, and copyright. And we are focusing on copyright in today's session. And copyright is actually the protection offered for creative works such as books, music, literary works, and you get some types of protection automatically, and for some you have to apply for. So it is mainly concerned with the copyright during this session. So before I hand it over to Hannah, I will be running another session on copyright issues in secondary data use next week on Tuesday at 10. If you are interested, you can just register for it. And this is the training and events QR code that you can scan from your mobile right now, or you could just visit our training events page and register for the copyright and secondary data use event, as well as there are some other research data management workshops that includes consent issues, ethical and legal issues in using data and anonymization and so on. All the events are there. If you're interested, you can just join and register. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Hannah.
Thanks for the intro, Hina. I'm going to carry on today with the introduction to copyright to talk specifically about copyright in publishing and copyright in teaching. So the first part of the session will be me talking through these kind of concepts. And then in the third section, we're going to do an interactive discussion where I'm going to show some of our most frequently asked copyright questions that we get on the topics of publishing and teaching. And we can go through those together using the poll and sharing some thoughts in the chat or unmuting and speaking so that we can figure out what the answers might be to those questions and hopefully show that you've learnt some things from the first two parts of the session. But first of all then, to talk about copyright in publishing. So just as a real starter for intro on copyright in publishing, copyright is important to publishing from the very beginning of the process of writing something that you intend to publish. So even when you're preparing your manuscript for publication, you want to be keeping copyright considerations in mind because when you're publishing a paper or a monograph or a chapter, the journal or the publisher would expect you as the author to sort out all of the clearance for any third-party material you might be using and to give any appropriate attributions that are required for the use of that third-party material. So when I say third-party material, I'm referring to use of substantial materials, so things like images or figures or tables, anything like that that you have sourced from a third-party resource. I'm not talking about short quotations that would follow just the usual quotation and referencing format used across academia. It's more about using a substantial amount of a third-party material. So I just wanted to start with that really to say that as an author, there are quite a lot of copyright considerations you need to be keeping in mind from the very beginning of the process of preparing your manuscript for publication. In terms of actual publishing itself, though, how your research is published will affect the copyright implications of your paper or your monograph, your output, whatever it might be. So there's lots of different ways people publish in academia. There's subscription-based journals, open access journals, hybrid journals, and then we have books and monographs, as well as open access books and monographs or chapters as well. So I'm going to talk through the different copyright considerations in these scenarios briefly now. So in a subscription-based journal, so this is a journal where you're publishing a journal article, and that article will be behind a paywall. So whoever's going to read that article will need to either log in or pay to read the full text of that paper. So this is subscription-based publishing, or sometimes called traditional publishing. When you're publishing a paper in a subscription-based journal, usually through the terms and conditions that you'll sign before you publish your paper, you as the author would be signing over the copyright to the publisher. In some situations, you might be giving the publisher a license to publish on your behalf, but generally in a subscription-based journal, you will be signing over the copyright. Usually though, you would keep the copyright to the author's accepted manuscript version. So you would usually sign over the copyright to the version of record, which is the final published text that has all the journal formatting and typesetting, the header, the footer, all of that, the final published paper you see. Usually that's what the journal or the publisher will own the copyright to. And as the author, you would usually own the copyright to the author's accepted manuscript. So that will be the final peer-reviewed text. So it's the final accepted version after it's passed through peer review, but it will be before the journal has copy edited and typeset the paper. However, even where you do own the copyright to the author's accepted version of the paper, there still might be restrictions in terms of what you can actually do with that version of the paper. And often the journal will say that there must be an embargo period on the author's accepted manuscript before it can be made openly available. So this will mean that you wouldn't be able to make that full text of the author's accepted version available via an institutional repository, for example, or via academia.edu or any of those kind of sites until a certain amount of time after the journal has published that text themselves. So it's important to understand what it is that you're signing when you're publishing a paper in this kind of journal. That being said, some journals do allow you to change their standard copyright agreements. So when you are presented with a copyright agreement to sign, do make sure you read it through and do feel free to challenge or ask for any elements to be changed. The publisher might say no, they might not allow for elements to be changed, but they might. So you can negotiate on some of the terms that are being offered to you when you're publishing a paper, and that might allow you to keep all the rights to the document and give the journal a license to publish, or it might allow you to have more control over what you can do with that author's accepted manuscript. For example, not having to wait for an embargo period. And I'm going to come on to that a bit later on, as there's a movement in the UK at the moment, rights retention, that is somewhat changing this. So I'm going to talk about that in a few slides' time. In contrast to a subscription journal, if you're publishing in an open access journal, then you as the author would keep all the rights to your work, including the published version. So both the author's accepted version and the final published version would be owned by yourself as the author, and the journal would then just get a license to publish that paper. So you would still own the copyright to it, you could reuse it, share it a lot more freely, because you are the copyright owner and you are just licensing the publisher to publish it on your behalf. A hybrid journal is a journal that, as the name suggests, is a cross between a subscription journal and an open access journal. So it will be a subscription-based journal that has the option for open access publishing for single articles. And in these situations, the author or their funder or their institution would pay a fee to make a paper openly available within that journal. So some of the content will be behind a paywall and some will be openly available. What this means in terms of copyright is that if you're publishing a paper open access within a hybrid journal, then it would work the same as if you're publishing in an open access journal. So a Creative Commons license would be attached to the work, and all the rights to that paper would remain with the author, just like when publishing in a fully open access journal. And similarly, if you're publishing behind a paywall in a hybrid journal, it will be the same as that traditional subscription model I outlined first of all, where the copyright is usually transferred to the journal. So while there's three different kind of categories of journal here, with a subscription journal, an open access journal, and a hybrid journal, the hybrid journal is just a combination of those two scenarios. So in terms of copyright, there's only really two scenarios here. One where you would sign over the copyright to the published version, usually keep the copyright to the accepted version, and one where you would retain copyright to both versions of the paper. So I've mentioned here about a Creative Commons license, or a CC license, as it says on the slide. So I just wanted to explain a bit more about these licenses. So when you're publishing open access, whether it be within a hybrid journal or a fully open access journal, the article will be published with a Creative Commons license, or a CC license. Now, you've probably seen CC licenses on various different papers and other materials, images, those sorts of things. And these licenses give a machine-readable label to copyrighted works to let the user know how they are able to reuse that work and under the terms of that license. So there's 4 different layers to a Creative Commons license that you can see here in the table, and these can be combined in different ways. So you could have a CC by SA license, as we've got here, or you could have a CC by SA NC license. So you can combine different elements of these in a way that will allow your work to be reused in the way that you would like it to. So the least restrictive layer to these Creative Commons licenses is CC BY, or CC BY, and this is always used in academic publishing because it means that reuse is allowed as long as the author or licensor gets credit or attribution for the work. So it means that if you're publishing a paper with a CC BY license, anyone can reuse it, share it, make an adaptation of it, any of these kind of things, but they have to attribute the original copyright owner. The next layer is a SA, which stands for share alike, and that means that the user is able to distribute a modified version of the work, but only under the same or a not more restrictive license as the original. So if the original had been shared under a CC BY SA license, then you wouldn't be able to make a derivative work and share it under a copyright or rights reserved license, because that would be a more restrictive license to the original. For the NC element, this stands for non-commercial, and that means that you can reuse a CC BY NC paper, but only for non-commercial purposes. So you can make money from the adapted version or any version that is reusing substantial content from a CC BY NC work. And the final is ND, which stands for no derivatives, which means that no modifications can be made to any reuse of that work. So this is the most restrictive layer of a Creative Commons license. So you can, as I said, combine different elements of these. So you might see a CC BY NC ND license, for example, and that would mean that the work could be reused, but only if there was attribution, it was for a non-commercial purpose, and there was no modifications there at all. So when you are publishing a work, you can decide which license you wish to choose. For some publishers, they might allow you to choose any combination. For others, they might have a couple of different options to choose between. But it's important to understand what these different layers will do to the ability to reuse your work. Once you have assigned one license, it can't be changed. So make sure you're sure on which license you're choosing. And also, it might sometimes be tempting to go for a more restrictive license, almost to protect yourself and protect your work. But actually, it can be quite it can sometimes be detrimental to the sharing and kind of broadening of your potential as a researcher to put a too restrictive license on there. So for example, if you put a CC BY NC ND license, that NC license might mean that it prevents someone from presenting at a conference where they're being paid to present and including your work there, because that could be deemed a commercial use. And the ND layer could potentially prevent a researcher in another country creating a translated version of your work, because that would be deemed as a modification or a derivative work. So that's not to say that CC-BY is always the correct option because it's the least restrictive, but it's just a warning to make sure you're thinking about what reuses you might be prohibiting by adding these layers of licenses. Of course, if you did put an NC layer into your license, for example, and someone came to you and asked your permission as the copyright holder to use it for a commercial purpose, and you were happy with that, you as the copyright owner could overrule your own license in that situation. But there can be quite a lot of extra admin involved and kind of just layers of restriction that you might wish to avoid. Just a final word on Creative Commons licenses before I move on. There is one other kind of Creative Commons license, a CC0 license, or also known as a public domain license. And this is where there are no copyright restrictions. So it's free to use in any way. You often see this on images on kind of sites like Pixabay or Unsplash, where you can get royalty-free images to use in presentations or things like that. You wouldn't usually see a CC0 license on an academic work, and that is mainly because of this BY attribution element, where academia is built on citations and attributing work to previous researchers. But CC0 is a license you will likely come across in other forms. Okay, so I mentioned before about rights retention and it being a movement in academic publishing that is allowing authors to have more control over the copyright of their papers. So rights retention has really come about because of research funders increasingly asking for open access publication. So in the UK, UKRI, for example, require that any publicly funded work has to be made openly available. And for journal articles, this is immediate open access. The trouble with this was that there can be a mismatch between a journal's policy and a funder policy. So I mentioned earlier that when you're publishing in a subscription journal, often even as the author in retaining the copyright on the accepted version of that paper, there are still terms and conditions that mean you can't share that accepted version until a certain amount of time has passed, which is known as an embargo period. With that, it could lead to your journal saying you have to wait 6 months to make that version of your paper openly available, while at the same time your funder is saying there must be a 0-month embargo period. So that mismatch is putting authors in quite a difficult situation. Because of that, rights retention has developed mostly within the UK, but it is increasingly being seen in other places as well, where authors are able to license the author's accepted version of their papers, open access under a CC-BY license normally, and they do that as a prior license, which means that before that accepted version even technically exists, they are already putting that CC-BY license on that version of the paper. And as I mentioned previously, once anything has been licensed in a certain way, it can't be changed. So in giving that prior license to an accepted manuscript, it means that regardless of what the journal's policy is on embargo period, you as the author will have already licensed that accepted version under a CC-BY license, and therefore would be able to share it in a repository or in other ways with no embargo period, because that prior license would kind of trump the journal policy. So this all sounds really quite complicated, and I do appreciate that it does sound quite complicated, but in practical terms, all that has to be done by an author to take advantage of rights retention is to add this statement you can see on the slide to a manuscript on submission to a journal. So it's really important that it is on submission, because that prior license part is the legal part that means that it cannot be overridden. So as the statement says, you would just put this on your paper when you submit to a journal. So for the purpose of open access, the author has applied a CC-BY public copyright license to any author's accepted manuscript version arising from this submission. So that's the author's accepted manuscript version, not the final journal published version. It's the text after peer review, before the journal formatting, typesetting, etc. And adding the statement, allows you as the author to keep control over that author's accepted manuscript. It means you can upload it to a repository with no embargo. It means you can add it to a reading list. It means you can email it to your students, can share it on social media, all of these sorts of things, because you would be the copyright owner and you would be openly licensing that version of the paper. So it's a really powerful tool. It's a really powerful movement in terms of copyright and re-empowering authors who might otherwise have been signing the rights away to their own work. So much so that an increasing number of institutions in the UK, I believe over 30 now, have institutional rights retention policies that mean this approach is the default for any papers published by authors at their institution. Here at the University of Essex, we have our own institutional author rights retention policies, and lots of other institutions in the UK do now too. So you might already be aware of this at your institution, or it might be something to consider looking into whether you have or not. So far I've spoken a lot about journal articles. So I'm going to speak now about books and publishing books and monographs and chapters. So in some ways, there's quite a lot of similarities between publishing a journal article and a monograph or other long form publication, but there are also some aspects that vary. So when it comes to book publishing, usually the publisher will ask the author to assign certain rights to the publisher under different situations. So generally, there are three kind of different scenarios, although the finer details of agreements do differ a bit more when you're publishing a monograph or a book or a chapter than they would do for a journal article. So I would encourage you to read through journal article copyright agreements as well, but I would very much encourage you to read a copyright agreement before signing anything when publishing a monograph, because they do differ more so. But the three most common scenarios would be, the first is where you would assign the copyright. So you assign the copyright to the publisher now owns the copyright to the work, but the author would usually get royalties or payments for the sale of the book that would be agreed through that copyright agreement. Second scenario might be that you you give the publisher exclusive rights to publish the work. So you as the author would keep the copyright to the work, but it's an exclusive right of that publisher you're publishing with to publish or disseminate their work elsewhere. And again, there'd be different kind of terms and conditions there around what would be classed as publishing or disseminating the work. And then in a non-exclusive rights agreement, again, this would be where the author would retain the copyright, but the publication of that book is usually still exclusive to the publisher, but wider dissemination outside of republication is more so allowed. So there's kind of three different layers here of how much control the publisher has and how much control the author has. But as I say, it's always important to read through the copyright agreements when publishing books, sorry. For an open access book or an open access monograph, it would be the same concept as publishing an open access journal article. So you would retain the copyright to the work, and you would choose a Creative Commons license to publish your book under. The open access element would be to the online, the digital version of the book, and usually the publisher would still print some print copies that would then be sold, and those print copies would then be licensed under one of these scenarios, with you getting royalties for the print sales. So the open access element would be for the online version, and that would be like with a journal article. So open access monographs are somewhat behind open access journal article publishing, but funders are increasingly asking for monographs to also be made openly available now as well. For example, UKRI's open access policy is now in effect for monographs and long form publications, but it doesn't need to be immediate open access. So there is space for an embargo period on making long form content openly available. So it's not quite so much of a pressing issue around the kind of rights retention and the ability for immediate open access as it is with journal articles, but it is still showing that there is a shift to open access across all academic publishing. I'm just going to pause now because I can see there are 2 questions, and after this slide, I'm going to move on to talking about teaching. So I'll just have a look at these questions first. So I can see what is the purpose of making an article not acceptable or restricted accessible? Is it ethical to restrict knowledge from other people? This is a really good question, and I am kind of biased on this because my job is open research development librarian. So open access and open research is really what my job is all about. But yes, I would say that it is unethical to restrict knowledge from other people. Here at Essex and at lots of institutions, we have general policies for making all of our research as open as possible and only as closed as necessary. So there might be some situations where research might need to be restricted. For example, potentially for some kind of safety concerns, if there was any research that was being done into sensitive topics. There's kind of a responsible research movement across the UK in terms of making sure that sensitive research doesn't get into the hands of people we wouldn't want it to. There's also the kind of questions around potentially confidentiality. If you've done some research that you're publishing that's used human participants where they might be easily identifiable, for example, then in those situations, restricted access might be suitable. But that's usually more the case around data rather than the final published papers, as usually it would all be anonymized in the published paper anyway. So there aren't usually too many reasons to restrict knowledge from other people, I wouldn't say, but there are some situations where it might be necessary or required. But generally, I would definitely be angling towards openness as far as possible, and that's reflected in the kind of funders policies that we've seen and UKRI policy that I've mentioned as well. And then the second question I can see here, if the publisher owns the copyright, is it transferable? For example, when the publisher is bought out by another company, do they need author's permission to transfer? No. So once you have transferred the copyright to the publisher, the author kind of waives all of their rights over that publication. So even if the publisher were bought by another company, they wouldn't have to ask the author's permission to transfer. A good example of this is outside of academia, but I don't know if anyone has followed the kind of copyright disputes that Taylor Swift has had with her music. So she was with an original record label and recorded her music. That record label, she signed over the copyright to those songs to the record label. That record label was then bought out by another company who she did not like, had issues with. But she had no control over those songs at that point because she'd signed the copyright over to the original label and then they'd been bought by this rival label. And that's why she recorded new versions of all of her music, which are known as Taylor's versions, because she was the writer of those songs, so she owned the original copyright to those versions. Of the kind of original score and the lyrics and things, so she could re-record them, but she had no copyright control over those original recorded versions. So it's similar to if you as the author had the copyright still to the author's accepted version, but not the final published version, you'd have no control over what would happen to the final published version if that publisher was bought out by another company. See another question here. How does that square with research funded via a sponsorship agreement asking for IP rights to be transferred to the sponsor? So IP is slightly different to copyright. So IP is copyright is a type of IP right. So it's a different layer there, which Hina touched upon at the start. So it just all depends on who owns which part that we're talking about here. So very often, if you're a researcher working for an institution, the institution, so your university, will usually own the IP to your work as you're working as an employee, but you would own the copyright to your papers. So I imagine it would be similar in those kind of situations where the funder might own the IP rights to the work, but not necessarily the copyright. So I hope that somewhat answers that question as well. Okay, I think there was maybe one in the chat as well. If you want to do, sorry, just reading the question in the chat. Want to do research related if I want to do the research related to public media content, such as photographs on social media, is it okay if I mark the author's name when I use the materials in my research that can be published on the journals, or do I need to contact the author? So photos on social media, would you need to mark the authors, give the attribution? I need to kind of look at the terms and conditions of the social media site that you were getting those images from, because it would depend on what license terms they'd been shared under on that website. But usually, and you would need to double check on the individual sites, but usually the copyright to images is kind of, you're almost giving up the copyright to your work, to those images, when you're adding it to a social media site. So I'll put my hands up and say I haven't read through all the terms and conditions of Instagram, for example, even though I do have an account. But when we're all signing up to these kind of social media sites, usually there will be a term and condition there saying that the copyright to those images will then be at least jointly owned by the social media site. So in those cases, it likely would be enough to link to that social media post. So depending on the referencing style, to reference properly to that social media post, to then go back to it as if you were referencing kind of a quotation within another publication. But if you were using the image to create something new, rather than just doing research on it and referring to it, then it would probably be different, and you'd need to look more so at the terms and conditions of that. So it's a bit complicated, and it would depend on the exact reuse. But generally, if it's just kind of referring to it in a research publication rather than reprinting it or anything, then it should be okay just to reference it properly. Okay, I'm going to move on now to talk about copyright for teaching. So as researchers, as academics, often we're doing research as well as teaching, and copyright does affect the way that you can use materials in teaching, and also what you can include on your online reading lists, assuming that you're using those as well. So when it comes to teaching and making other copyrighted academic written work, so other journal articles, books, magazines, all of those sorts of things, available for teaching, lots of institutions within the UK will have a CLA license, so a copyright licensing agency license for higher education. So you will need to check whether you have one of these licenses at your institutions. But here at Essex, we do have a CLA license for higher education. And what these licenses cover is they cover copying from books, journals, and magazines. And generally, they just make it easier to reuse content for the purpose of teaching. So the license terms allow for the copying of up to 10% or one chapter, whichever is greater, from one book. Or for a journal article, it would be one article from one issue of that journal. And these could be copied and shared with students or staff in the institution. And they also need to all be reported under the terms of the license. So the CLA need to know what copies are being made of what materials every year to ensure that their license terms are being complied with. So the way that this is generally achieved is by the copies that are being made under the terms of the CLA license, and this will usually be either manually photocopying chapters from print books, or making a version of a one article from a journal article available, one article from a journal rather, available via a reading list. So most of the copies that are made under CLA licenses are shared via online reading list platforms. So platforms like Talis Aspire, for example, and other online reading list platforms. And this is generally the case because for two reasons. One, these platforms can be restricted to just students and staff at the institution, so individuals need to log in to access that content. And two, because often these reading list systems have reporting mechanisms built into them that allow much easier reporting to the CLA of those scans that are being made or those copies that are being made. But so the CLA license is really helpful, and it allows for much wider reuse of content for educational purposes than is otherwise possible under the standard UK copyright legislation. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. So that's one of the blanket licenses that are available within higher education that we use to expand the way we can use materials for teaching. And another is the ERA license. So this is the Educational Recording Agency license. And this allows for the sharing of recorded materials. So things like TV broadcasts and radio broadcasts effectively. And again, this needs to be restricted to staff and students, but it extends to the staff and students can record or make copies of programmes for educational use. It must be for educational use, not just for entertainment and not for any kind of commercial activity. So not for just a film screening that's kind of a SU film screening to get students all together or anything like that. It must be for educational use. And again, the recordings can't be shared on public platforms. So again, stick to reading lists or virtual learning environments like Moodle. And it allows programs or clips of programs to be shared through these platforms or embedded in presentations that might be shown in the classroom, for example. One way that an ERA license is quite often used at higher education institutions is to subscribe to Box of Broadcasts or BOB, which allows for many TV programs and films that have been broadcast in the UK to be accessed via that online database. So that is one of the uses of the ERA license that lots of institutions use it for. So that's two of the blanket licenses that we use to enable wider reuse of copyrighted materials within education than is generally possible under UK legislation. But if you don't have one or both of those licenses, there are still some exceptions in the UK copyright law that enable reuse of materials specifically for teaching. So section 32 is known as illustration for instruction, and this is the main exception within UK copyright law that we refer to in higher education because it is specifically for illustration for instruction. So copyrighted materials can be used under this exception where the sole purpose is instruction. So this is open to interpretation as lots of things in copyright and especially around copyright exceptions. But generally when we're looking at copyright exceptions, we want to think about whether the use is fair. So it's what's known in UK copyright law as fair dealing. And so we ask ourselves some general kind of points, some of which are specific to specific exceptions and others are more broadly applicable when using copyright exceptions. So if we think about this copyright exception specifically, what we're looking for when we're evaluating whether we can use a material under this copyright exception would be, is the use for non-commercial purposes, it's purely for instruction, and does it have sufficient acknowledgement? So these are the terms of the exception. So it must be a non-commercial use, it must be purely for instruction, and there must be sufficient acknowledgement of the original source. Now, non-commercial seems quite straightforward, but as we know, we do charge students in UK for university study. So there is some question of whether a university is a non-commercial use, but the consensus across kind of UK copyright is that, yes, it is a non-commercial use because we are running not-for-profit. We're not here to make profit from our students. So the consensus is yes, it's not a commercial activity in so much as it would be defined in that way. The other thing we ask is the use for instruction. So sometimes people would say that this could only be used if it was for in-class materials. So materials where you're going to stand up and instruct from that material. But especially since COVID, the general agreement on this has been that online platforms like reading lists or Moodle pages, Blackboard, all of those sorts of things are an essential part of teaching and are an extension of the classroom. And therefore, we do consider those uses as for instruction as well. So generally then, you can use this copyright exception to enable the use of materials within university teaching. but we do still need to ask kind of some general fair dealing questions. So the sorts of things I'd be looking at are, is the copy that we are making, so is the, say I've copied a few pages from a book, I photocopied it, or I've scanned it in and I'm using it on my reading list for my students. Are those few pages directly relevant to what is being taught? Am I reproducing an unreasonable proportion of the original text? Is the use really a replacement for purchasing an additional copy? Could the reuse damage the interests of the copyright owner in any way? And have we acknowledged the author and the source adequately? So all of those kind of questions, it kind of comes down to a bit of common sense around these things. And a good rule of thumb, I always think, is put yourselves in the position of the owner of the copyright and think whether you would be happy with your work being used in that way. So at the start of the session, I've been talking about copyright in terms of publishing. And the good thing in academia is often we are creators of copyrighted materials ourselves, as well as users of them. So it's easier to put ourselves in those shoes and think, would I be happy with my material being used in that way? If generally you think you would be happy with your material being used in that way, and you've thought about those kind of fair dealing questions, it's usually okay. But if in doubt, get in touch with your copyright advisors, speak to colleagues and get a second opinion there. We do this within our copyright team here in the library. We're often still asking each other questions on how far we would interpret uses as fair if we're using the exceptions. So it's always best to be overly cautious, but there is always a certain element of an appetite for risk around using copyright exceptions. Okay, so that was a lot of me talking. So thank you for sticking with me on the content here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to us having a bit of a discussion to answer some of the common copyright questions we get asked within my team. If you hadn't already established, copyright isn't always straightforward. So as I say, we do often find it helpful to discuss some of these different scenarios. So I thought it might be helpful for us to do the same today. So what I'm going to do is on each slide, there's going to be a question, and I'm going to run a poll on each slide just to ask what you think to the question. So the answers will always be yes, no, or it depends. And I just ask you to select one of those from the poll. And then if you're happy to, please feel free to unmute and explain your reasoning. You can raise your hand first. Or if you'd like to just put in the chat your reasons behind putting yes, no, or it depends, then we can have a bit of a discussion. Okay, so I'm going to launch the poll now. So if I just, hopefully you can see that question now on the slide. So the question is, do I own the rights to my PhD? So what do you think? So as a PhD student, would you own the rights to your PhD thesis? Yes, no, or it depends. And if anyone would like to put raise their hand and explain their reason or put their thoughts in the chat as to why they've written what they have done, that would be great. Just give you a couple of seconds more. Thanks, Jodie. I can see in the chat here that you've put students have different rights than academics. Yes, students do have different rights than academics. That is an important point, or very often they do. I will end the poll and I will share the results. So we can see that the majority of people have put yes, that you would own the rights to your PhD thesis. We've had one no and a few it depends as well. So someone has put it's part of your journey, so you have the rights to fully take the responsibilities. Another, I think certain elements of your PhD, your own research and ownership depends on how your research was funded. Sometimes the funder would own the copyright. It's an interesting point. It depends. Some of the material may be for more than one student or author. Depends on funding, repository licensing. Okay, so I can see there's some good thought going on here. So generally, As students at university, you would own the right to your PhD thesis generally. It can vary by institution, but the norm is that as students, you're paying for to be there at the university. So you would own the copyright. In contrast, as a member of staff, the person who said that students have different rights to academics, as a member of staff, it's more likely to be the case that the institution would own the copyright, although often they do allow the authors to act on their behalf when it comes to copyright. But yes, so generally PhD students do own the copyright to their thesis, but there's some really important points here in the chat as well, because if your research is funded, then maybe it might be the case that they have some ownership, maybe dual ownership of the copyright, although not always. So again, you need to check the funders' policies. The point about different material is an interesting one, and we're going to come back onto that in a moment. And the repository and licensing, usually you would own the copyright and then you would choose how you would want your work to be licensed in the repository. So increasingly theses are licensed CC BY in repositories, but there is usually a choice there as well. Okay, so oh cool, we've just had someone in the chat saying at their institution the uni requires deposit with CC BY, NC, ND license. That's quite restrictive, but yeah, it does vary. Okay, so the next question then, so I will relaunch the poll. So this question, can I use images I don't own in my PhD thesis? So again, we're a PhD student at this point, we're writing our thesis. Can I use images that I don't own in my thesis? So again, yes, no, or it depends. And any thoughts, very welcome in the chat. Okay, I will stop the poll and share the results. So most people have gone for it depends. And I can see some thoughts coming through here in the chat. But Jodie, I like your answer, and that was going to be my response. So generally, yes, you can use images you don't own in your PhD thesis, but it couldn't necessarily be published. And we're going to come on to that in a moment. So yeah, Nathaniel's point here, it depends if you acknowledge them. Yes, so you would always need to acknowledge the sources of where you were getting your images from. But the reason that I say that, and why Jodie has also said yes, you can use images in your PhD thesis, is because there is a copyright exception for education and research, which means that you can use a reasonable amount of a third-party resource within material that is being used purely for education, which your PhD thesis would be. But I'm going to come back to lots of these other points in the chat in a moment, because and I won't run the poll again because we've kind of gone naturally onto this one. The next question is, can I include the images I used in my research in my publication? And this goes back to more what is coming through in the chat here. So publication is different. So if you're going to be publishing your PhD thesis, you have to think about any of the third-party copyright materials you are using. So you would then have to, because as Owen has said in the chat, each image will have its own copyright and its own publishing status. So yes, exactly. Gemma has said here as well, for example, if it's a participant's image, they could give consent for use of it. And if it's images from a third party, they could give permission for you to use it. So if the image is owned by someone else and there is a specific license on that image, you would need to abide by that license. So it might be a all rights reserved license, and in that case, you'd need to ask their permission. It might be that it was a CC BY image, and in that case, you would just need to attribute the original copyright owner. So this is where you need to be familiar with the license of the third-party materials you're using as well. And And this all becomes really, really relevant and important when you're publishing. So while the previous question, I said you can use a copyright exception to use images in your PhD thesis, if you're going to be publishing it or openly sharing it, then you need to be thinking about all of these elements as well. So what I would always recommend really is for any third-party material you're using within your PhD thesis, I would always want to make sure that I had the right to share it, because chances are you will be doing that after you finish your thesis. See a question in Q&A. So I can see a question in the Q&A for articles that are published not open access when you transfer the copyright to the journal. Yeah. Are you able to still share the non-published version of your manuscript with others freely? So for instance, the publisher gives you 50 free PDF copies to share, but can you share the non-journal version freely beyond the 50 allowed copies, e.g. among colleagues? This will depend on what the rights are for your author's accepted version. So the non-published version that's what you mean there by the author's accepted version, I assume. So the final peer-reviewed text, but before it's all been formatted, typesetted. It depends what has been said in your publisher agreement. In some cases, there are specific terms and conditions of what you can do with that accepted version. This is where that author rights retention that I was talking about really helps, because if you've taken advantage of author rights retention, you've already licensed that accepted version, CC BY, and therefore you would then be able to share it beyond those 50 allowed copies, for example, among colleagues, and any other use you might want to do. So it depends, but with rights retention, that makes that more straightforward. Okay. Yes, Owen, I would always recommend keeping a record or a log of each image and where you got it from, and what the license was, and especially if you've asked for any permission, then yes, make sure to keep a record of any licenses you've purchased or any permission emails you've received to use any third-party materials. Okay, next question then. Can I reuse content from work I have published before? So if you have published a journal article, for example, and now you're going to write a monograph based on a similar topic, can you reuse content from that journal article in the book, for example? So can you reuse content from a work you've previously published? Some quicker answers coming through this time. Happy to hear any thoughts in the chat as well. Okay. Share the results again. So we've got mostly it depends, a few yeses and a few nos, and some chat message coming through. Depends on who owns the copyright to the original. You can only who owns the copyright on the previous work. Need to cite it properly. Yes, exactly. So it depends on the licenses. It depends on who owns the copyright, even if it's written by yourself. So if you've signed over the copyright to that journal article to the publisher or to the journal, then you would need to treat that work as any other that you hadn't authored, because you've signed over the copyright to the publisher. So it depends. It depends on whether you still own the copyright or not, and you would always need to self-cite as well. So a very similar question, but there is a reason I'm asking separately. So can I reuse figures from my published work in my future work? So again, imagine you've published a journal article. It's got some figures in there that you've created. So you have created those figures yourself. Can you reuse those figures in your future work? Okay, so yes, so again, it does depend, and it does depend again on who owns the copyright for the figures. Exactly, thanks, Nathaniel. The reason I ask this separately is because there are things you can do to ensure that you do own the copyright to individual elements of your work. So a figure, for example, you might develop during the earlier stages of your research before you come to publish the paper. If you're researching some data, for example, and you come up with a figure or a model or something along those lines, you could upload it to a site such as Figshare, and it would then be attributed to you. You would get a DOI for that figure, and you could assign a Creative Commons license to that figure individually. That then means that you can include that figure because you own the copyright and you've openly licensed it in a journal article, for example, that you're publishing. But then even if you sign over the copyright to that journal article, to the journal, if you then went on to write a monograph or to present at a conference where you wanted to use that figure is still owned by you and is still openly licensed. So you wouldn't need to then get permission just to use that figure because you'd included it in a journal article that you'd published elsewhere. So there's kind of all these layers to copyright that's worth keeping in mind. And it's another benefit of openly sharing different parts of your research process as you go through, rather than keeping everything restricted and closed until it gets to publication, and then you might sign that over to the publisher. So it's just worth keeping in mind there as well. Okay, so some questions about teaching then. Can I put my reading materials on a virtual learning environment? So a virtual learning environment like Moodle or Blackboard or one of those kind of platforms. Can you put materials that you want your students to read on a virtual learning environment? So a PDF of a journal article, for example, or a scan of a book chapter. Hear any rationale in the chat? Okay. Or quieter on this one, people may be less confident on the teaching side of things. So we've got a mix here between yes and it depends. So I see Peter has commented here, people do it regardless, but they should go to appropriate channels. Depends on the copyright status of the materials. Guessing this is the extension of a classroom point. It is related to that, Nicole, yes, but it does generally depend. So yes, as Peter has said, you would need, it varies by institution, because if you have a CLA license and you're making the copies available under the terms of the CLA license, then there needs to be a mechanism for reporting these copies, and usually that will be via a online reading list platform rather than via a virtual learning environment. So here at Essex, for example, we don't have, people don't upload their teacher, well, people shouldn't upload their teacher materials to Moodle directly. And we ask for them all to be shared via our online reading list platform so that we can report them to the CLA. So likely, if you have a CLA license, there will be a similar situation at your institution. But the question earlier about the extension of the classroom, that's related to the copyright exception. So if you're making a small proportion, because it is generally a much smaller proportion when you're doing it under a copyright exception, of a work available under that copyright exception rather than under the terms of a license, then you might be able to share it on a virtual learning environment, particularly if it is still password protected. So yes. And then the other point depends on the copyright status of the material. That is another really valid point, because if it is a open access article, for example, and it's a CC BY openly available paper, then as long as you were attributing the original source, it would be fine to share on a virtual learning environment. So there are different layers there. How about ResearchGate is a question. Notice lots of scholars have shared their work there. ResearchGate and those kind of sites are a difficult one, because in some situations that's perfectly legitimate, and in lots of others it might not be. So there's quite a lot of reported cases of where authors will sign over the copyright to a publisher, but then still make the final published version available via ResearchGate. which then would be in breach of the copyright agreement they signed with the publisher. However, if the paper is published open access and it's an open license, a CC license that enables that kind of reuse, then it can be legitimate to share it on ResearchGate as well. So ResearchGate is always quite a difficult one, and we tend not to direct our students to ResearchGate, because if it is legitimately shared on ResearchGate, there'll be another alternative open access source we can direct to anyway. So that's the approach we tend to take with it. Okay, so the next question then. Okay, I wrote the chapter, so I can do whatever I like with the full text. I think you're noticing a trend on quite a few of these. Okay, so share these results. So we've got a mixture of no and it depends. The answer here would be it depends. It depends on whether you own the copyright or not. So there were lots of no's, and in lots of cases with chapters, especially the situation would be no, because open access is still quite far behind with chapters and monographs and things. So we do see frustration with our researchers where they might be trying to make a chapter available via a reading list for their students, for example. It's a chapter that they've written, but if they've signed over the copyright to the publisher, which is the norm for chapters, they still wouldn't be able to make that available on the reading list unless we owned the book, it was covered by the CLA license, or we would pay the copyright fee to make it available in that way. And the fact that they've written the chapter is irrelevant, basically, unless they still own the copyright. Okay, the next one then. It's freely available online, so I can share it with my students. So there's a text that you found freely available online, and therefore you can share it with your students. So yeah, great. Some comments coming through in the chat here. I'll share the results as well. So we've got another it depends here. Yes, so openly available is not the same as licensed openly. Exactly, Jodie, thank you. And as Nathaniel said, we need to check the CC license. Colleagues often use public domain for things freely available. So if it was a public domain resource, yes, exactly, it's public domain would be able to be used, but freely available is not the same as public domain. Yeah, so check the license and mark how it will be used. Exactly. The point is that not all freely available materials online are legitimate. And if something has been illegally uploaded, we wouldn't be openly directing our students to that source. And it's basically the same point I was just making about ResearchGate. We only want to be including materials on reading lists or sharing materials with students that are legally available. Okay, so I think this is the third from last question. So I only want to use a few pages, so it's fine to scan and share. So you've got a book and you want to scan a couple of pages and share it with your students. Okay, so Jodie, I can see you put here in the chat, fair use question mark. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to be really picky, Jodie, and I hope you don't mind, just to say that fair use is the American term, and in UK copyright law we have fair dealing. It's just a bugbear of mine because they are slightly different, but absolutely agree with your point. The whole point here is it can be a legitimate point. It depends on if the use is deemed fair. So as I mentioned earlier, the copyright exception that allows for illustration for instruction can mean that if you're using the small portion of the work just for illustration for instruction, just with your students, then this could be a legitimate use under that copyright exception. Generally, the kind of general consensus is that 5% of a work is generally deemed fair, but I tend not to stick too closely to that number because then people can sometimes think, oh, well, as long as it's under 5%, it's fine. But there's all those considerations that I mentioned earlier around fair dealing and what it can and can't be interpreted as. The other point in the chat here, Nicole, if it's within the 10% limit, so that would be if it's a book that's covered by the CLA license. So yes, if you have a copyright licensing agency license and the work is covered by that, if it's within the 10% limit, which is what that allows for, then yes, that would also be legitimate. And Nathaniel, really good point there on if the uni owns the book. You do have to, under the terms of the CLA license, legally own the copy of the work to be able to make it available in that way. Yes, it would definitely, Gemma, depend on who you're sharing it with. So to make use of the exception, you would want to be only sharing it with the people who directly needed it for that illustration for instruction, which would again be a reason why we would usually share these in password protected platforms. So we're only sharing those copies with the people who actually need it. Okay, next question. Okay, so it's very old, so copyright doesn't apply. This is the second last question. So yes, no, or it depends. Okay, I can see some interesting points coming through into the chat on this one. So let's share the results. We've got it depends again as the majority, which yes, it would depend. So generally in UK copyright law, 70 years after the author's death, written works in the UK are no longer covered by copyright law. And they would therefore be deemed in the public domain 70 years after the author's work. So Nicola said here only once it becomes public domain, I think, which is, yes, a valid point. But there are some other considerations. It might be that copyright has been passed on to other people, because typically, yes, as Jodie has said, copyright does expire on a written work in the UK 70 years after the author's death, but it can be extended. Bear in mind also that international laws differ. So if the author is covered by copyright law in a different country, you would need to look at the copyright law within that country because that 70 years varies. Within UK copyright law, the rules also vary for different types of materials. So for example, broadcasts are protected for 50 years from the date the broadcast was made. So again, it differs there. But generally, for a written work, 70 years after the author's death in the UK law, that work would no longer be covered by UK copyright law and it would be termed in the public domain. And on the 1st of January every year, we kind of have Public Domain Day, where a new set of written works enter into the public domain. The important thing to remember with this, though, also is there are these layers of copyright, as I kind of mentioned earlier with the Taylor Swift example. But to take a different example, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, for example, the original text of that is in the public domain. It's no longer covered by copyright because it's been many more than 70 years since Jane Austen died. However, if you were to get a copy of the Penguin third edition of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, that book is still under copyright. It's the original text that is out of copyright. So the original text can be made into a derivative work of a new film of Pride and Prejudice, but that new film would then be covered by copyright. It's often more easily remembered with films, but with books, people sometimes think, oh, well, that book is out of copyright, so I can scan it and share it, but that book itself likely won't be. So it's just important to remember those different layers of copyright there. Okay, so the final question then, hopefully an easy one to end on. No one will know, and it will help my students, so it's fine to use. So we've got a resource. No, we've got a book. It's on my shelf. I'm gonna scan it, send it around to my students, and no one will know, so it's fine to use. Okay, we seem to have consensus here on this one. So everyone has said no. So the answer here is no, of course. But I wanted to end on this just to kind of highlight a few important points. I think sometimes with copyright, people can think it's there as kind of a restrictor, and it's there to sometimes make life difficult, and can sometimes be frustrating. But I think the good thing to remember with copyright is to take yourself back to the start of this session when we were talking about publishing works. Think about if you'd written the work, you would want others to respect it and respect you as the creator. So using copyrighted works, putting yourself in the shoes of the creator is really the best way to think about it, I always find. But that being said, be generous with your work, I would say as well. So we had the point earlier of is there a reason to restrict work? And in some situations it might be yes. But also in lots of situations, the answer is likely no. So if you can openly share your work, use an open license, allow other people to use it in a way that you're happy with it being used, and make that easy, especially in academia, that's really important. And it enables then copyright to be an enabler of creativity and an enabler of innovation and of good research, because if we're sharing our research with Creative Commons licenses and enabling other people to use it, but in ways that you're happy with. So with attribution, for example, or not for commercial reuse potentially, those sorts of layers of those CC licenses we talked about. We can use copyright in a way that brings really positive benefits because we're able to have better control over how it's being reused in a positive way. It's also just important to remember on this specific question, sometimes or often individual risks are low on copyright misuse, but when you're working within an institution, the risks on an institutional level are high, and there could be kind of serious reputational and financial ramifications if copyright misuse was found. But as I say, it's more than that for me. Copyright is a way to enable us to share work in a way that we want to respect the creators, to give credit to the creators, and to enable that kind of academic conversation to keep going in the way that we want it to. So copyright isn't always seen as the most fun topic. So thank you all for coming along today and listening, but hopefully you'll have seen it in a different kind of light and seen the benefits that come with understanding a bit more about how copyright works and how it can be used in a way to benefit you and benefit the work of yourselves and your colleagues as well. I'd be really happy to hear any further questions, thoughts, or ideas that any of you have following the session today, and whether it be a specific question or any kind of reflections. You'll also be sent a feedback form, I believe, when you close out of the session. So please do provide any feedback. It's really helpful to know how we can shape these sessions going forward. Anything you might want to see added or covered, that would be great as well. If you have any direct questions, you can email me, or I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to connect there too. But otherwise, thank you all for your engagement with the session today and joining in with the activity at the end. It always works a lot better if we get people adding their thoughts in the chat. So that was all really great and helpful. And thank you all for coming.